Today, we as citizens must face the fact that we live in a violent society. Every day, it seems, an innocent person becomes the victim of another ruthless murder. But even more alarming is the growing number of mass murders. Those crimes where one homicidal maniac brutally kills several innocent people with no apparent motive. This type of heinous crime has never been more prevalent than during this century. And that is why we bring you...
I think it's difficult to understand. I think that the idea we all have some elements of hostility in ourselves, some potential violence within all of us, that under some conditions we could kill. It's difficult to think that we would find it pleasurable, erotic, enjoyable to quietly strangle one person after another. I don't think that's part of the normal human who has been socialized within a particular culture. That's a peculiar thing. I think it is a very unusual, psychiatrically disturbed type of pleasure.
In 1962, the city of Boston fell into the grip of a psychopathic killer who raped and strangled 13 women. For 2 years, the city was paralyzed by this madman who became known as the Boston Strangler. His victims ranged in age from 19 to 85 years old. What made their deaths even more horrifying was that in each case, the victims were discovered lying in gruesome positions with their legs spread wide and the murder weapon twisted tightly around their necks and tied into a neat bow. On November 5th, 1964, a man named Albert De Salvo was arrested for rape in an unrelated case. After further investigation, it was eventually learned that this unassuming plumber was indeed the demented strangler of those 13 women. Apparently, De Salvo had used his handyman trade as a way of entering the apartments of these unsuspecting women.
The man showed a detailed knowledge of superintendents of apartment buildings in hundreds of apartments in the greater Boston area. He could call them by name, and he would refer to the first and last name of the superintendent and say, he sent me to do some specific repair work. He would also use the name, both first and last name, of the resident of the apartment. Mary, the superintendent Harry Jones sent me. Mrs. Smith, the superintendent Fred Brown sent me. This was his standard method of gaining entry and to get potential victims to relax to let him get into the apartment.
The extent of De Salvo's lust for rape led him to commit these brutal crimes. But what made these murders especially notable was his trademark of tying a bow around each of his victims' necks. He wanted his handiwork to be recognized.
It's not an uncommon thing with people who engage in serial murders. They leave some sort of clues because now they have acquired another little small joy in their life. Beating or putting off or feeling superior to a huge enterprise called the criminal justice system, that they are able not simply to kill and get away with it, but leave little telltale elements behind to provoke and make those police and detectives feel unhappy. You found that, I suppose, most classically with Jack the Ripper, who sent postcards and letters to newspapers and the police indicating, giving himself the name, Jack the Ripper. Try to catch me. In effect, they try to do that. Now, it could be to tease them, or it can be, as some people have suggested, sort of leaving clues so that they're being caught, annihilated, can be sped up. William Hirons, who killed some people, wrote the famous phrase on a mirror, "Catch me before I kill more." That may be that element too. So it's complicated, but I suspect it's like, I'm still smarter than the police, as uneducated as I am. I leave them little notes to make them feel provoked and unhappy. Here I am killing and you can't do anything about it.
By the time it became evident that De Salvo was indeed the Boston Strangler, the court proceedings had become mired in a web of confusion. While De Salvo had freely admitted in prison that he was the Strangler, the doctors had declared that he was mentally incompetent to testify in court. As a result, the courts were unable to charge De Salvo with the murders, and instead, they could only convict him of the rape charges for which he was originally arrested. While De Salvo awaited his prison sentence, he was temporarily placed in a mental hospital. Then one morning, A guard looked into his room and discovered that the Boston Strangler had escaped. Apparently, Desalvo had gained access to a key and was able to open his own door. Fortunately for the police, Desalvo gave himself up the very next day. He was then sentenced to life imprisonment. When Desalvo was finally sent to jail, his lawyer, the well-respected F. Lee Bailey, tried to have Desalvo placed in a mental institution. What we should do with Desalvo, he argued, is to try to figure out what kind of man would rape and strangle to death innocent women. We should find out what exactly was his motivation for these 13 brutal slayings.
In every case, there was some considerable sexual pleasure in seizing control over a woman, frightening her, brutalizing her in some way, having sex with her, and frequently it ends here. He went on and found there was an additional pleasure, thrill, satisfaction with killing. So his package became sexual pleasure, gratification, and an equal, perhaps even greater pleasure in killing a defenseless woman.
In 1973, 6 years into his prison sentence, Albert De Salvo, the Boston Strangler, was found stabbed to death in his cell, a befitting end to one of the cruelest murderers of the 20th century.